Hey guys, tonight we're wandering into the sands of ancient Egypt, a place that looks glorious from the outside, but turns out to be hot, itchy, and very, very uncomfortable once you step inside. This is history for sleeping. Long, slow, boring history for sleep. And I'm your sleepy historian, guiding you through a day you probably wouldn't survive, waking under a roof of reeds that leak sand instead of rain, chewing bread so gritty it doubles as free dental work, and trying to stay alive while the gods, the heat, and the flies all seem to be against you. It's a world where the Pharaoh shines like the sun, but you, the ordinary soul, spend your short life sweating, scratching, and hoping the afterlife has fewer bugs. Before we drift back in time, a small reminder. If you enjoy these quiet journeys, you can subscribe to Historian Sleepy 365. It helps keep these long, sleepy stories coming, the kind of boring history for sleep you can return to whenever rest feels far away. So, switch off the lights, settle under the sheets, and let's begin our slow walk through ancient Egypt, where eternity was the goal, but surviving a single day was already too much. You open your eyes before you're ready. There's no alarm clock, no cat pouncing on your stomach to wake you. Only one thing, light. Egyptian light doesn't bother with politeness. It doesn't knock, doesn't wait for a greeting. It slices straight through the gaps in the palm-thatched roof and slaps you in the face as if the sun god, Ra, was saying, "Get up. I didn't build this entire civilization for you to sleep in." Your bed, if you can call it that, is nothing more than a mat of straw laid over packed earth. It's not soft like a spring mattress, and there's no plush pillow in sight. It's more like a dry, hardened cake, and you're the filling pressed inside. You shift your weight, and the straw crackles. A stalk jabs you in the back, a tiny needle reminding you that sleep in Egypt isn't meant for indulgence. It's only there to give you the minimum strength needed to endure another day beneath the sun. The air in the room is heavy, thick. You take a breath and catch the lingering scent of last night's cooking fire, blended with the dry dust of mud brick walls and the sweat soaked deep into linen after too many nights. It's not a pleasant symphony. It's the smell of existence. It reminds you that you're alive, but there's no luxury in that breath. You raise a hand to your face. Your skin is damp, not from washing, but because the sweat has already started flowing before you've even sat up. In Egypt, sweat doesn't wait for motion. It volunteers, eager, dependable. If there were an award for most dedicated worker in your body, sweat would take the prize. The light keeps pushing in, etching harsh gold lines across the earthen floor. You turn your head to the right and see your thin linen sheet, the thing meant to be a blanket, bunched up in the corner of the mat. Last night, it tried to hold a little warmth. This morning, it's become a damp, sticky cloth clinging to your skin. The ancient Egyptians took pride in linen. They saw it as clean, refined. They even wrapped their pharaohs in it. But lying on a straw mat on a muggy morning, linen feels no different than a wet curtain pressed against your back. You sit up. Grains of sand fall from your hair onto your shoulders, as if someone had sprinkled salt on a breakfast that hasn't begun. Sand is everywhere, in your hair, in your ears, between your toes. You may have bathed yesterday, but this morning the sand has returned. More loyal than friends, more patient than family. If there's one relationship that defines Egyptian life, it's the one you have with sand. You reach for the small clay jug in the corner. The water inside has long since lost the coolness of night. Now it's just a warm, earthy liquid. You take a sip, not because you like it, but because you have to. Here, water is life. The Egyptians called the Nile the mother of all. But when you drink it, this mother doesn't taste like milk. It tastes like someone scooped a handful of earth, mixed it with hope, and gave it to you. Morning sounds begin to drift in. The bleating of goats in the distance, a child's cry, sharp and sudden, then silence. The steady clack of a handmill grinding grain. It's a familiar rhythm, a background hum to daily life that no one notices until it's gone. Pelicans call out from the riverbank. A light breeze slips through the palm leaves overhead, bringing with it a little dust. Not cool air, just wind laced with sand. A free service from nature. You stand. For a moment, the earth beneath your feet is cool before the day's heat begins to seep in. In the corner, your reed sandals wait, light, scratchy, and utterly useless against stray pebbles. In Egypt, sandals don't protect you from the world. They just help you pretend you're ready. And when you step forward, some tiny stone will find a way in anyway. An unwanted companion for the journey ahead. You wrap your linen kilt around your waist and tie the cord. The motion is practiced, swift, but still requires care. Tie it too loose and it'll slip. Too tight and you'll suffocate in the heat. This isn't just dressing, it's strategy. You glance down at your wrist. A small faience charm, bright blue. It won't make you cooler, but it reassures you the gods are watching. Or at least, you hope they are. You step into the courtyard. The sun has already claimed it. It's barely risen, but it burns brighter than the oil lamp that kept the night away. Your shadow lies short across the ground, as if the sun wants to remind you. This day will be long. You look up at the roof. Bundles of dry grass laid out yesterday are still there, waiting to be burned. The scent of straw mixes with earth, forming something unnamed, not unpleasant, but not perfume-worthy either. In the corner, the grinding stone still holds traces of white powder from the emmer grain crushed last night. You run a finger across the rough surface and think about breakfast. Bread as hard as stone, beer as thick as porridge, no latte, no pastry. In Egypt, breakfast is compromise. It fills the belly, not the senses. A fly circles your ear, you wave it off. It leaves, it returns. Egyptians live with flies the same way they live with the sun. You can chase them, but you'll never win. And some days you wonder if the flies are the real owners of this land, and humans just temporary renters. You glance down the narrow alley where sunlight spills in patches. The mud brick walls on the left are already warm. On the right, a little coolness remains. This is Egypt's version of air conditioning. Choose your wall. You decide to walk to the Nile to wash your face. Maybe breathe something fresher, though you know the air won't be cleaner, just different. Less straw and dust. More mud and fish. Before leaving, you take a short breath. It carries the salt of sweat, the smoke that still lingers, and the thin dust that drifts in everything. Not pleasant, but it's all you have. And in that fleeting moment, you understand something. In Egypt, you never truly own your morning. The morning owns you. And so, a new day begins. Hot, sticky, crowded with sand, and no option but to accept it. You lift the clay jug, step out into the alley. The sunlight hits your face like a dry slap. But that was only the morning's hello. You step into the alley, feet dusty, carrying an empty clay jug. Your destination is the Nile, the river everyone must visit each morning. In Egypt, the Nile is both lifeline and burden. Without it, there is no Egypt. But living with it isn't exactly a happy marriage. It's more like a partner you can't leave, one who's always shifting, always changing moods. The path to the river is narrow. The mud brick walls on either side have cracked, revealing dark slits in their seams. A neighbor walks ahead, carrying an empty bucket, her steps quick and familiar. So familiar she doesn't need to look where she's going. You follow, hearing the soft slap of reed sandals on dry ground. Now and then, a chicken bursts across the path, leaving behind a scribble of tracks in the sand. The closer you get to the river, the more the smell changes. Dry earth and smoke give way to the sour scent of mud, of drying fish, and damp weeds. You could recognize the Nile even with your eyes closed. It's a smell that never hides, a strong, slightly acidic blend that somehow feels familiar enough to bring comfort. The sun is still low, but already its light turns the surface of the river to liquid glass, as if someone had scrubbed a mirror too hard, leaving behind streaks of harsh brightness. The current moves slowly, seeming gentle, but underneath is a force strong enough to change a nation's fate. The Nile can grow a harvest or wash away a village. You set your jug down and bend to wash your face. The water is nothing like the paintings, not cool, not clear. It's warm, dense, and feels like it's passed through 100 rooftops, 1,000 fields before arriving here. You splash some on your face. Immediately, the taste of mud creeps into the corners of your mouth. Cleanliness in Egypt is a relative concept. You don't come out pure, you just swap one kind of dirt for another. Beside you, a few women are washing clothes. They dip linen into the river and slap it against the rocks. The rhythmic thuds echo like mourning drums. Mud-tinged bubbles spread out and drift downstream. Freshly washed linen doesn't smell like flowers. There's no softener. Just the scent of weeds, stagnant water, and a trace of the river you'll bring back home. A boy leaps into the water with a splash. You see his mother shout after him, worried but not surprised. Swimming in the Nile is normal and dangerous. Nile crocodiles can grow over 5 meters long, and no one wants to meet one in the morning. But children still play, believing that Sobek, the crocodile-headed god, would never harm his own. You're not so sure. You rinse your hands, then lower the jug into the water. The clay cools against your fingers. They tremble slightly, not from the cold, but from the quiet knowledge that in this water lives both health and harm. To drink it is to invite in bacteria, parasites, and hope. Hope that your body will fend them off. Egyptians have no other choice. The Nile is doctor and disease, both. Farther out, a group of men row a boat made of bound reeds. It looks fragile, like a breeze might flip it. But their movements are practiced. It's as if the wind and waves are old friends. In their baskets, fresh fish glisten, silver fins flashing in the sun. Fish isn't an everyday meal for most. It's a small gift from the Nile, one you might share in, if the catch is kind. You look down at your feet, soaking in the shallow edge. The mud squishes between your toes, soft but sticky. You lift your foot. A few small leeches cling lazily to your skin. You brush them off and tell yourself, at least it's free bloodletting. Some Egyptians believe leeches can heal. But when one latches onto your ankle, that belief doesn't offer much comfort. On the riverbank, a few men are washing emmer wheat in the water. The grains float, drifting with the current. Some are scooped back up. Others float away, maybe to take root somewhere else along the shore. The Nile gives, it wastes, but no one blames it, because when the Nile chooses to keep something, no one can stop it. You run a rough wooden comb through your hair, sitting on a warm stone. Sunlight bounces off the river and onto your face, a backward mirror. You see the dark circles under your eyes, the straw-dry hair stiff from dust and river water. But in Egypt, appearance isn't about beauty. It's about endurance. If you want makeup, that's for the upper class with jars of black coal. You just hope your skin doesn't burn too much before the day ends. An ibis glides overhead, its raspy call echoing through the air. The Egyptians see the bird as sacred, the symbol of Thoth, god of wisdom. But when it cries above your head, it sounds more like metal scraping metal, sacred in scrolls, but in real life, just another noisy bird. You scoop a bit of water and pour it over your shoulder. Wipe quickly. That's your entire morning bath. No fragrant soap, no soft towel, just river water, your hand, and the hope that the mud smell fades just a little. Cleanliness here doesn't mean no scent, just less of one. When you lift your full jug again, the sun has climbed higher. The walk home feels twice as long. Your shoulders ache. Your arms shake from the weight. Water, the thing that feels like nothing, has real heft when you carry it, step by step. You pause to rest. Sweat pours down, mixing with dust on your skin. The result? A fresh coat of mud, co-produced by body and earth. You look around, children still play at the river's edge, women keep scrubbing, men board boats, no one complains, no one is surprised. This is daily life. Without the Nile, no one survives. But with it, you trade safety for sickness, crocodiles, and fatigue. You walk on, carrying your jug, the scent of silt, and the feeling that you've just signed another silent contract with the river. I take life from you and give a little health in return. In Egypt, the Nile isn't a scenic view, it's a heartbeat. And that heartbeat echoes every morning beneath the sun, through the splash of water, the hum of insects, and the quiet sigh that escapes your chest. You return home with the heavy clay jug, sweat pouring off you like you've just stepped out of a steam room, one no one thought to charge for. Inside the small earthen house, sunlight slips through cracks in the straw roof, slicing into thin, sharp beams. That light also reveals your breakfast, a meal entirely unrelated to the idea of pleasure. On the straw mat sits a basket of emmer bread. It's not soft, not airy, and it certainly doesn't smell of butter. The loaves are hard as bricks, heavy in the hand, their crusts rough with embedded grains of sand. Egyptians like to joke, or if they ever had a concept of humor, that eating bread was like biting into the desert itself. And they weren't wrong. Sand seeps into the flour from the grinding stone and settles into every bite. You break off a piece. The sound it makes is no different from snapping dry wood. You bring it to your mouth. Your teeth react instantly, as if crunching gravel. There's no sweetness, no trace of butter or yeast, just the thick taste of emmer flour mixed with fine grit, forcing you to chew so long it feels like you're grinding down an old riverbed. You could call it whole grain, taken to an extreme. In modern times, it would likely be marketed as 100% organic, high-fiber, sand included. To get it down, you reach for the small jug beside you. It doesn't contain milk, not tea either. What you have is beer, but not the golden, bubbly kind in glass mugs. Egyptian beer is more like fermented porridge made from barley or emmer. Thick, cloudy with a sour tang, as if someone mixed leftover oats with fruit left to rot just a bit too long. You take a sip. The heavy liquid slides down your throat, leaving behind a slick coating. To be fair, it offers a bit of energy, a slight buzz from the fermentation, and, most importantly, it's safer than the river water you just carried home. Egyptians believed beer was a gift from Osiris, but if this was a gift, then the god had a fairly dark sense of humor. Beer in the morning isn't for joy, it's for survival. Instead of coffee to wake you up, you begin the day with something that makes you full and sleepy. A strange choice, but a sensible one in a world without Starbucks. Outside, the sound of children arguing over the larger piece of bread drifts in. A mother shouts, her voice rough from speaking too much yesterday. Inside, you keep chewing. Your teeth grind against bits of sand. the sound like stone against stone in a grain mill. It's not poor cooking, it's a feature. Modern archaeologists have studied ancient Egyptian skeletons and found severely worn teeth, evidence of a mineral-rich diet no one asked for. You think of the modern idea of a hearty breakfast: eggs, milk, pastries, fresh fruit. Then you look down at your dry, brick-hard loaf and your thick beer, the texture of cold porridge. A hearty breakfast in ancient Egypt simply means something to chew and something to help it go down. An old man in the house takes a sip of beer and sniffs. He repeats the familiar story. In the old days, our ancestors built the pyramids on nothing but this bread. It might be true. After enough emmer lobes, you could probably build a pyramid yourself, at least from the resulting stone-like waste after a few weeks. You manage to swallow the last bite, feeling another corner of a tooth chip away. Thankfully, the beer helps. Not good, but it goes down. Even the children drink it. In Egypt, beer doesn't have an age limit. It's the only liquid safe enough to live on. Each sip a reminder that what you're drinking is civilization itself. In the corner, a woman prepares the next batch of dough. She mixes flour in a clay basin, kneads it by hand, and shapes it into rough lobes. They go onto a hot stone slab. No oven, no thermometer, just habit and feel. The smell of baking spreads, mingling with smoke and straw. It's not inviting. It's like standing in a burning granary. You take another sip of beer and wipe sweat from your brow. Breakfast ends, leaving your stomach full, your mouth dry, and a hazy feeling that you've just eaten part of the desert. No French breakfast, no Italian coffee, only emmer, beer, and the quiet truth that you'll repeat this ritual for the rest of your life. As you step outside, you glance back at the still full basket of bread. It's no treasure, just a reminder. Survival is a long chain of chewing and swallowing things no one would ever write into a cookbook. But you have no choice. The ancient Egyptians ate sand bread and drank porridge beer, not because they wanted to, but because it was the only way to begin a new day. Breakfast behind you, a test of dental endurance more than appetite, you step out from the small earthen house. The Egyptian sun is now high, its light bouncing off the golden sand like thousands of tiny mirrors. The air is stifling, dry as dust, as if someone had placed a massive kiln directly above your head. This is when Egyptians begin work, and work means labor. Physical, relentless labor. If you're a farmer, that means the Nile's floodplain. If you've been conscripted, it may mean one of the great building projects. Wherever you are, the shared outcome is the same. Your body will give in long before the sun does. You walk with a group out to the fields. The silted soil along the Nile may look greener than the desert sand, but don't mistake it for paradise. After the floods, the ground is thick with sludge, its sour smell rising up with the buzz of endless mosquitoes. The tool in your hand isn't a gleaming plow. It's a heavy wooden hoe tipped with worn copper. Each swing into the earth lands like an axe on stone. Far off, cattle drag crude plows through muck, while children dart around, pulling weeds and shouting. The man next to you is shirtless, sweat running from his back in streams. But the idea of a break doesn't exist here. In this world, the sun is not your worst enemy. An empty stomach and an emptier granary are far more dangerous. You bend low, sweat dripping into the soil, mixing with the mud, leaving blotches like spilled salt. You wear no gloves, your hands are raw, blisters rising and splitting. Still you continue, because if you don't, there is no bread, even if that bread wears down the teeth of an entire village. If you're not in the fields, you're likely at a construction site. Ancient Egypt had no shortage of projects, pyramids, temples, tombs. Standing before a pile of stone, you might ask, Who thought to move multi-ton blocks in 40-degree heat? Answer: not you, but you'll be the one to do it. You and dozens of others tie thick ropes around the stone. Beneath your feet, the sand burns like coals. A rhythm chant begins, then you all pull. The rope bites into your shoulder, dust clouds rise, and the stone creeps forward like a stubborn beast. No cranes, no hydraulics, just people, ropes, and the hope that Ra won't roast you dry before the stone reaches its place. Some modern minds assume slaves built the pyramids. The truth is more complex. Often it was common folk, conscripted out of duty. Maybe they were fed, maybe there was shelter, but the trade was long days bent double, aching bones and bloodied hands. You don't need action films to see pain. Just one day at an Egyptian worksite is enough. If you were born a woman, life isn't easier. After cleaning, cooking, and caring for children, women also labor in the fields. They grind grain by hand, stone against stone, leaving shoulders and arms sore beyond telling. Every kernel crushed, every grain of sand that slips into the flour is traded for effort and hours. Egyptian women held more legal rights than many in their time. They could own land, trade, even divorce. But don't let that fool you. The daily truth is still sweat, dust, and cracked hands. You could write your name on papyrus, but you still kneaded dough, cooked over fire, and gave birth without a doctor in sight. By noon, the sun is straight overhead. There is no concept of an 8-hour shift. Work continues as long as light allows, from dawn until dusk. Rest, when it comes, is brief. A few gulps of thick beer. Enough to avoid thirst, not death. Lunch is no different from breakfast. More rock-hard bread, more sour beer, and if you're lucky, a few dates. Around you, the sounds of hoes cutting dirt, ropes dragging stone, and the quiet groans of fatigue. No one laughs, no one sings, except for the work chants, to keep rhythm, not joy. If there's humor, it's the kind that grimaces at itself. There's so much sand here that if I drop dead, at least my grave will be well supplied with filler. By day's end, your back screams, your legs threaten to give, your mouth feels like cracked clay. You think of last night's cramped straw bed, and for a moment, it feels like paradise. The only heaven you're reaching today is a nap, short and dry before morning returns and everything begins again. Bread, beer, fields, stone. With a day like this, the question isn't whether you'll survive, but whether your teeth will crack before your spine bends. Either way, you wouldn't last a day as an ancient Egyptian. As the day's labor slowly draws to a close, you might glance toward the horizon and see a figure every Egyptian knows well, the shadow of the Pharaoh. He's not out here in the fields or on the worksite, but his presence hangs over everything. The Pharaoh is not just a ruler. He is the embodiment of the divine on earth, a being of flesh and blood, yet somehow beyond all mortal bounds. To you, a farmer, a laborer, he is barely human, more a blend of God and king, so distant that your suffering will never reach his ears. And yet, every drop of sweat that darkens the soil, every callus on your hand, is silently offered to him. If you think modern kings can live lavishly, imagine a man whose breakfast doesn't involve hard bread and sour beer. The Pharaoh dines on meat, rare fish, honeyed fruit, wine, luxuries you might smell faintly when passing the granary gate. He lives in a palace, floors cool with stone, ceilings high for the breeze to move. You live in a clay hut, thick with heat. He has attendants waving fans, burning incense, and musicians playing softly in the background. If sometimes life feels unfair, in ancient Egypt the imbalance was seen as natural, because the Pharaoh is not just a king, he is Horus on earth. His power stretches so far, there is no corner of your life untouched by it. When you plant seeds, it is to surrender part of your crop, to his stores. When you haul stone, it is to build his tomb, an eternal home for the afterlife. When you drink that gritty, stale beer, you might quietly thank him for allowing such a drink to exist as part of your ration. Each day you live is one more circle spun around the orbit of this God King. You may never see him with your own eyes, but his image is everywhere, etched into temple walls, painted on papyrus, carved into stone statues that watch you with unblinking eyes. The Egyptians believed the Pharaoh preserves Ma'at, the cosmic order, the balance of the universe. If mosquitoes bite you if you thirst or go hungry, it's not Pharaoh's fault, it's because you've not lived in harmony with the order. If floods destroy the crops, perhaps the gods are testing you. Pharaoh, in this belief, cannot be wrong. He is merely the bridge between people and the divine. And in this system you have no right to question. You can only keep grinding grain, keep stacking stone, and accept that your fate is as small as the grains of sand tangled in your hair. At sunset you might hear drums and flutes drifting in from the palace or temple, sounds of a festival you'll never attend. Exhausted, you lie on your straw mat. And imagine a blurred vision, a feast where the Pharaoh sits on a throne, goblet of wine in hand, surrounded by dancers, musicians, and the perfume of incense. Meanwhile, your home smells of sweat, sand, and smoke. Same country, same sun, but your life and Pharaoh's are universes apart. And yet the irony, it's you and thousands like you, Wafa, who make Pharaoh's life possible. Without your hands hauling stone, without your grain, without your fermented beer, his palace and tomb would remain only dreams. The Pharaoh's absolute power is built on your absolute smallness. But instead of outrage, Egyptians accept. Because to work for Pharaoh is to work for the gods. You may be drained, but it's part of a grand order far beyond your understanding. From a modern view, it seems brutal. One person broken to feed the comfort of another. But in the ancient world, this was stability, the very foundation that allowed Egypt to endure for thousands of years. Where other civilizations crumbled, Egypt held on, thanks in part to its unshakable belief in the Pharaoh, be he just or cruel. As you close out the day, you might think, I survived. But really, you survived because you moved within the gears of power. You had no choice, no voice. Only a few hours of rest before another morning pulls you back into Pharaoh's service. This wasn't the life you dreamed of, it was the life you were placed into, and all you could do was endure. And if you think such hardship belonged only to Egyptians, look sideways at other ancient worlds. In Mesopotamia, people wrestled with the Tigris and Euphrates, rivers whose sudden floods could wipe out entire seasons overnight. In the Indus Valley, everything depended on the monsoon winds. If they failed to arrive, famine came quickly. Every early farming society lived in the shadow of water, weather, and disease. But Egypt had one more thing: sand. Sand in the bread, in your clothes, in your hair, in your lungs. Sand wasn't just the ground. It was part of daily life. If the Mesopotamians feared flood and the Indus people feared the wind, Egyptians lived with the haunting, eternal presence of sand, both endless and inescapable. And it was within that harshness that Egypt rose, a civilization that carved out pyramids which still pierce the sky today. You can imagine that when night falls in Egypt, your exhausted body may rest, but your mind never truly does. Because in this world, everything has a god behind it. Sand is not just sand, it is the breath of Seth. A flood is not just water, it is a gift or a punishment from Happy. A stomachache could be from hard bread or the wrath of a wandering spirit. And when you have no doctors on call, no aspirin, no electrolyte mix, you're left with amulets, herbs, and a trembling hope that someone above is still watching over you. Life is short, illness is always waiting, but instead of rebellion, the Egyptians turned it into order. They lived alongside the gods, begged for miracles and healed with cures half-rooted in science, half-whispered in magic. So now let us gently step into another part of Egyptian life, where dust and sweat give way to gods, spells and strange healers who stood between the living and what waits beyond. When you think of Egypt, the first images that come to mind are likely the towering pyramids or the slow-moving Nile cutting through the desert. But if you had lived there, you'd know there was something even more present than the pharaoh, more constant than the gods, even more common than the bread you ate each day. Sand. That small, seemingly harmless grain was the enemy that clung to you from the moment your eyes opened to the second they shut. You could sweep your house clean in the morning, and one light gust would dust everything again as if your broom had never touched the floor. Sand was like an uninvited guest who never left, never even considered it. It slipped into your food. The bread you bit into this morning, already hard as a brick, now offered an extra crunch thanks to a few stray grains of sand. If today we call it a topping in ancient Egypt, this one came free, and no one could refuse it. You chewed, heard your teeth grind, and felt the enamel wear away. A short life may well have begun with meals filled with invisible grit. There were no dentists to complain to, only the quiet acceptance that your teeth would wear down like the very stones of the desert. Sand crept into your sleep. You could lie on a mat woven from dry reeds, but by morning you'd rolled over into a bed of grit. It hid in your hair, clung to your skin, snuck into your eyes. Some mornings it felt like you hadn't slept in a house, but in a sandpit shrunk down to fit your frame. You scratched, sighed, and accepted that rest would never be truly restful. If you thought bathing would free you from sand, you were mistaken. You could wade into the Nile, scrub yourself clean, rinse the dust from your limbs. But the moment you stepped onto the riverbank, a breeze would pass, and your feet would be coated again as if you had never washed at all. It felt like laundering a white tunic, only to spill a cup of coffee on it moments later. Every effort was undone. You couldn't beat sand, you could only lose to it quietly. Egyptians even made sand part of their beliefs. Sand was the domain of Seth, the god of chaos. Dust storms weren't just natural events, they were signs that Seth was angry. When the wind rose, your eyes burned, your lungs tightened, and beyond the discomfort, you worried that the gods were sending warnings. To the Egyptian mind, sand wasn't just matter. It was meaning, it was power. It shaped their world without ever needing permission. Sand was also medicine. Strange as it sounds, some papyrus scrolls record the use of hot sand as a treatment for pain or skin ailments. You can picture it, sand, the same enemy you cursed all day, heated and poured onto your body to heal you. An absurdity only possible in a society where survival meant making peace with whatever the world gave you, even if it came between your toes. And perhaps as someone lay beneath the sun, burning sand pressed to their back, they wouldn't know whether they were being treated or simply slow roasted. Sand seeped into language too, and into the mind. The Egyptians called their land Kemet, the Black Land, to distinguish it from the Deshret, the Red Land. But in truth, that line was never clear. Sand always found a way to reach into the fertile zones by the river, reminding you that abundance was fragile, just a temporary island in a sea of grit. You might sow seed today, only to find tomorrow that the sand had covered the edge of your field. Every harvest was a quiet battle between people and sand, and most of the time the sand won. People simply endured. In daily life, people developed ways to push back. Linen cloth to wrap their faces, windbreak walls, houses built away from the prevailing winds. But no matter what you tried, sand stayed, like a rude guest in the center of the room. No one invited it, but everyone learned to pretend it belonged. Eventually, people stopped fighting, they adapted. The same way we now live with city dust, ancient Egyptians lived with sand. More of it, sharper, more relentless, but still the same quiet surrender. And the irony? It was sand that preserved Egypt for the future. Because of its dry heat, so many things survived: mummies, pottery, even scrolls of papyrus. The very thing that tormented people then is the reason we remember them now. A single grain of sand in your eye can bring tears, but billions of grains covering a tomb can protect it for thousands of years. If you'd asked an ancient Egyptian, they likely wouldn't find this poetic. They'd just be busy picking sand out of their soup. But we, looking back, can see sand for what it truly was, both an enemy and a keeper of memory. And so day after day, you live with sand. Whether you're a farmer, a builder, even a noble, the sand finds you. The elite may have better ways to shield themselves, but imagine a pharaoh, entombed in gold, still resting beneath a heavy layer of sand, absolute power coated in dust. Only the silence of the desert remains. The common folk didn't need philosophy to learn that lesson. They'd always known, no matter who you are, you don't escape the sand. If Egypt had to be described with a single sense, it wouldn't just be the sight of the Nile. It would be the feel of sand on your skin, in your eyes, between your teeth. You cannot tell the story of Egypt without it. It is the silent backdrop of every scene. Sand doesn't scream, it doesn't bleed. It simply wears you down grain by grain, quietly, steadily, like the rhythm of life in this place. If you lived in ancient Egypt, you'd quickly realize that the world around you was never just natural. Every phenomenon, every sensation, every event was tied to a god. When the sun rose in the morning, you didn't just see a ball of fire climbing the sky. You saw Ra, the sun god, rowing his boat across the heavens. And when night fell, you knew Ra wasn't resting like you. He was beginning a dangerous journey through the underworld, battling the great serpent Apophis so that light could return again tomorrow. You never just said good morning. You greeted a victory, a cosmic battle, won yet again so the day could exist. When the Nile flooded, it wasn't hydrology. It was either a blessing or a warning from Hapi, the god of the river. If the waters rose just right, your crops would flourish. Too high, and your home might be swept away. Too low, and the soil cracked with thirst. In all cases, people bowed their heads and prayed, for only the gods could determine what came next. Hunger wasn't caused by dry ground. It was Hapi refusing to smile. Even the wind wasn't just wind. A cool northern breeze was the gentle breath of Shu, the scorching gusts from the western desert, the harsh, dry exhale of Seth, god of chaos. If today we complain when the air conditioner breaks, in ancient Egypt you simply hoped Seth would stop breathing on you. In your kitchen, placing bread on the fire, you weren't free of the gods either. Osiris gave wheat. Renenutet watched over your harvest. That dense, sandy loaf might make you curse, but you were still grateful. At least the gods gave you something to eat. Most Egyptians didn't think of it as bread. They ate the gift of Osiris. If you were full, he was generous. If you were hungry, perhaps you'd done something to offend him. When you fell ill, things got even more complicated. A headache could be from the sun, or from a spirit haunting you. You didn't know. So you went to the healer. He'd give you herbs and chant a spell, invoking divine names to drive out misfortune. You drank the mixture, you listened to the charm, and you never truly knew which one helped. But that didn't matter, because to you, both were part of the same cosmic order. The gods were present in every ache, every cure, every final breath. Even love wasn't exempt. If you quietly admired someone in the village, you might whisper to Hathor, goddess of love and music. But if that love soured, you'd blame Bastet, the cat goddess, for toying with your heart like a mouse. The gods weren't just in temples, they lived in glances, in laughter, in every time your feelings were returned or rejected. What's strange and strangely comforting is that not all gods were distant. To Egyptians, gods took familiar shapes: a cat stepping over your threshold, a Nile fish caught in your net, a falcon soaring overhead. The world around you was full of signs, and you were taught from childhood: watch closely, listen carefully. The gods are always speaking through every small thing. If a cat enters your home and curls up to sleep, it's not just coincidence. It might be Bastet offering her favor. If a fish tangles in your net, it's not just dinner. It's Sobek, the crocodile god, giving you a gift. And don't think only commoners believed it. The Pharaoh, considered the child of gods, was just another player in this divine drama. If he built a temple, it wasn't vanity, it was devotion. If he won a war, it wasn't strategy. It was because the gods chose his side. If he lost, they were testing him. Everything that happened could be traced to some god's will. That made life, however harsh, feel like it had a reason. Nothing was random, nothing meaningless. All was woven into the fabric of divine intention. From a modern view, this system might seem complex, bizarre, exhausting. But to Egyptians, that complexity was comfort. When a child died of illness, they believed he had returned to Osiris. When the harvest failed, they believed it was a test. Next year, perhaps the gods would be kinder. In a world where death always waited nearby, faith in the gods was the only way to keep living. And of course, there was room for irony. You can imagine an Egyptian in the heat of the day fanning themselves and muttering, "Ra's overdoing it again?" Or when the Nile overflowed, joking, "Happy must be in the mood to redraw the map." They lived with their gods like you live with a difficult neighbor, respectful, cautious, but still muttering complaints under your breath. The gods were distant and close, terrifying and ridiculous, and that's how Egyptians endured, by turning everything into a story they could live with. In the end, to live in ancient Egypt was to live in a crowded universe. There was no space truly empty, because somewhere a god was watching. You might hate the sand, curse the heat, choke on gritty bread, but you always had a reason, an explanation, someone to blame. And when every hardship had a god behind it, you didn't need to find your own answers. You just kept praying, kept enduring, kept living. You wake one morning, your throat burning dry, your head pounding as if someone had been hammering from the inside. In the 21st century, you'd reach for a bottle of cold water, pop an aspirin, and lie back in an air-conditioned room. But in ancient Egypt, there was no 24-hour pharmacy, no doctor on hospital night shift, and certainly no air conditioning. What you had was the village healer, a man whose job sat at the thin, trembling edge between science and sorcery, between medicine and spell. The Egyptians believed illness wasn't just caused by bacteria. It might come from spirits, gods, or a disturbance in the balance of the universe. So when you went to see a healer, you weren't just visiting a doctor, you were visiting a man who was part physician, part priest. He held a small copper scalpel in one hand, a scroll of papyrus in the other. And somewhere in between, he mumbled incantations meant to drive off invisible forces. You watched him, unsure whether to feel reassured or worried. Ancient papyri like the Abers and Edwin Smith scrolls recorded hundreds of remedies. Some sound oddly familiar, even reasonable. They used honey for wounds, and today we know honey truly has antibacterial properties. They used garlic for digestion, and modern science agrees garlic contains natural antibiotics. They used willow bark for pain, which contains salicin, the ancient precursor to aspirin. There are moments when you might nod and say, so maybe we and the Egyptians aren't so different after all. And then you read further. To treat a cough, they might prescribe a mixture of honey and crocodile dung, or a paste made from crushed insects and milk. To them, what mattered wasn't just the ingredient, but the spell that accompanied it. If you didn't chant the words correctly, the medicine wouldn't work. And if you complained the medicine was hard to swallow, they might tell you your faith just wasn't strong enough. In a world where sand constantly invaded the eyes, causing burning and infection, the Egyptians developed countless methods. They'd mix honey, tree resin, and milk, and drop that thick, sticky blend into your eyes. Not a cool, soothing drop, but something more like lukewarm porridge. And when your eyes stayed red and swollen, the healer might say you needed to invoke Horus, the god who once lost an eye in battle with Seth. Maybe the knowledge that even Horus suffered eye pain gave you some strange comfort. In the healer's small reed hut, rows of clay jars lined the wall. Herbal oils, scented resins, animal fats, even dried insect remains. Each, they believed, held its own energy, and with the right words, that energy could defeat illness. Today we'd call it placebo. To them it was divine intervention, and to their credit, the Egyptians weren't afraid to experiment. If a recipe failed, they'd try something else. One scroll records a treatment involving moldy bread used for wound healing. Surprisingly, moldy bread contains penicillium, a primitive kind of antibiotic. They were brushing close to penicillin thousands of years before Fleming, but they didn't explain it with microbes, they explained it with magic. For women, medicine was equally curious. There's a method written on papyrus for detecting pregnancy. You water barley and wheat seeds with a woman's urine. If the seeds sprout, she's pregnant. Sounds bizarre. Yet modern research shows the hormones in urine can indeed speed germination. The Egyptians didn't know about hormones. They believed it was proof that Hathor had smiled on you. And alongside all the herbs and ointments, there were also spells and charms. You might wear a green stone scarab to protect you from fever. Hang a papyrus with Isis's name to guard against sickness. Belief wasn't just swallowed, it was worn, hung on walls, carved into clay. In Egypt, there was no sharp line between medicine and religion. They were the same thing. Step into one of their healing rooms, and you'd smell sharp herbs mixed with animal fat and earth. You'd feel the healer's hands spreading paste on your skin and hear him whisper a prayer to a god whose name you can't pronounce. You'd lie there, sweating, aching, strangely unsure if this was healing or ritual. And still, you'd feel safe. Because sometimes it doesn't matter if the treatment works. Sometimes just being touched, spoken to, cared for, that alone is enough to make the pain feel smaller. And the truth is, we're not so different now. Today we have doctors and pills and science. But people still wear lucky bracelets, carry amulets, whisper prayers before surgeries. The ancient Egyptians were just more honest about blending both. So when you think of Egyptian medicine, don't just think of strange prescriptions, think of it as a strange cocktail. A spoon of honey, a smear of crocodile fat, a whispered chant, and a flicker of fragile hope. You drink it, you grimace, you exhale, and for a moment, you believe the gods are watching. And sometimes, that belief alone is enough to keep you going for one more day beneath the burning sun. You open your eyes in a small mud brick home, not as a farmer, but as a woman in ancient Egypt. And the truth is, Many modern scholars often praise how Egyptian women had more progressive rights than Greek or Roman women 1,000 years later. That's true, on paper. But you'll quickly realize that rights don't cool the sweltering heat, don't lighten the heavy jars of water, and don't make childbirth any less excruciating. Legally, Egyptian women could own land, sign contracts, run businesses, even divorce their husbands if the marriage soured. A wife could write a separation agreement, keep her property, and move on with her life. It sounds modern, a leap through time, far ahead of medieval Europe. But still, you're the one baking the bread each day, weaving the cloth, raising the children, and scraping sand from under your nails. You might step out to the market, past rows of onions, garlic, dried fish, and barley. With your linen bag in hand, you haggle, trade, and buy like any other small merchant. No one glares at you like they might in Greece, where women were often hidden away indoors. But this freedom still comes with sweat trickling down your back as you push through crowds thick with the smell of fish and 40-degree heat. At home, you are both the laborer and the emotional center. You rise with the sun, grind emmer wheat into flour, mix it with Nile water, and bake bread as hard as river stones. You pour thick, fermented beer for your husband, your children, and yourself. Not golden ale in a cozy pub, but cloudy, sour drink with grain sediment floating in every sip. Every meal revolves around your hands, your fire, your patience. And if you complain, only the sand hears you. Giving birth is inevitable, but terrifying. There is no anesthesia, no hospital. You give birth on the dirt floor, maybe helped by a few neighbors. They burn incense, place protective amulets under your pillow, pray for the gods to watch over you. But the risk of dying in childbirth is real. Many women do not survive the pain. If you do, you're left drained for weeks before returning to the same cycle of baking, washing, and carrying. Some women are luckier. Upper-class ladies wear fine linen, bathe in scented oils, adorn themselves in gold, and have servants at their call. They might even serve as priestesses, standing equal to men in ritual. There was even Hatshepsut, a queen who ruled as Pharaoh, her statues carved as if she were a king. But these were rare exceptions. Most women lived ordinary lives, backs bent from water jars, hands blistered from pounding grain, skin darkened from sun and soil. You could take your husband to court for mistreatment. On paper, you might win, but in reality, you still return to the same home, the same unspoken boundaries that no law has ever needed to write. You might wear a charm of Taweret, half hippo, half lion, protector of childbirth. You might pray to Isis, mother of Horus, to lend you her strength. Religion becomes a kind of sedative, a reason to endure just one more day. And when the average life expectancy is only 30 or 40 years, you understand your time is short. There's no long stretch of old age. You grow up, marry, have children, and vanish, leaving behind monuments of stone that go on standing in the sun. The bitter irony? Egyptian women had more rights than many others in history. But that didn't make life easier. You could sign a land contract, but you still had to haul the water. You could file for divorce, but you still had to rise before dawn to knead the dough. You could pray for divine protection, but still face the pain of childbirth alone. And so when you look back, you feel both admiration and sorrow. Admiration for the strength of women who endured so much with so little. Sorrow because even with rights, they lived inside a cycle of hardship that history rarely bothers to record. Today we talk about women's rights in boardrooms, in newspapers, in marches. But if you listen closely to the sound of grain being pounded in a small house beside the Nile, you understand rights may exist, but it is daily life that decides your fate. And in ancient Egypt, the fate of women was sweat, sand, and pain no one else could carry for them. You've just passed the age of 30. In the modern world, 30 is the beginning of maturity, a time for career plans, travel, or maybe buying a home. But in ancient Egypt, turning 30 was already a kind of premature aging. If you made it to 40, you were luckier than most. The reason? Life here was never gentle. The bread was hard and full of sand, worn teeth with every meal. Skulls from excavated mummies revealed teeth riddled with cavities, many ground down nearly to the root. The Egyptians had never heard of dentists, comfortable chairs, or electric drills. The most common treatment was simply to endure, or to smear on a paste of herbs and honey and pray that Thoth might take pity. Labor tore at the body no less. You might haul water, stack bricks, plant barley, or drag stone for some royal project. Your knees swelled, your back ached, your hands grew thick with calluses. Skeletons of ancient workers showed twisted spines, cracked vertebrae from heavy loads. Today, we'd call it a herniated disc and book an MRI. Back then, you lay flat on a straw mat, hoping the pain would fade enough to keep working tomorrow. Even small illnesses could become a death sentence: a scraped knee that grew infected, a mosquito bite carrying malaria, a bout of diarrhea from unfiltered Nile water. There were no antibiotics, no probiotics, no activated charcoal tablets. You could drink herbal tea or chant a spell, but the bacteria didn't listen to gods. Women bore the highest risk in childbirth. Labor could become tragedy in a matter of hours. Mummies reveal young women, dead in their 20s, buried alongside unborn infants. It pulled the average life expectancy even lower. In families where mothers lived into old age, they were considered rare. Children, too, were never guaranteed to survive. One fever, one cough, and the child might be gone. If you had 10 children, maybe 5 or 6 would grow up. It sounds cruel, but this was normal. Egyptians didn't see illness and death through the lens of medicine alone, but through religion. A fever might mean Seth was angry. A wound that wouldn't heal might be the work of a malevolent spirit. So the physician was not just a healer, but also a spiritual guide. He'd write prescriptions for herbs, but whisper spells alongside them. The Ebers Papyrus, one of Egypt's great medical texts, lists hundreds of remedies, many followed by prayers. May Horus grant healing. The Edwin Smith Papyrus, famed for the earliest surgical instructions, also contains invocations to the gods. This was Egypt's defining feature, the intimate bond between medicine and magic. In Greece, illness was tied to Apollo, but Hippocrates would later separate health from the divine. In India, Ayurveda combined herbs and spirit, but leaned toward internal balance. Only in Egypt could a salve be applied with a spell, a tea brewed beneath an amulet hanging over your chest. This reveals how Egyptians saw the world, everything in order, everything under divine influence. A doctor wasn't just treating the body, he was the bridge between the sick and the sacred. And when life was so short, when death could arrive at any hour, perhaps faith was the only medicine that brought calm. You, an ordinary Egyptian, knew you might not live long. Perhaps 20, perhaps 30, perhaps 40. You didn't hope for 60 or 70. Funerals were common. And so you learned to accept. Today we grumble over a 3-day cold. In Egypt, a 3-day cold could decide life or death. You reach for a painkiller. They reached for fermented beer and prayer. You schedule a doctor's visit. They called upon the gods. Looking at their brief lives and constant illness, we begin to understand why they devoted so much thought to death and the world beyond. Because this life was fragile, death was inevitable, and preparing for the next journey was the only comfort they could truly count on. You see, even while alive, the Egyptians endured so much that even their breath carried the scent of sand and sickness. And yet to them that wasn't the worst part. A short, weary life was only the prelude. What truly mattered came after the heart stopped beating. Today you might worry about paying rent or your phone running out of battery, but an ancient Egyptian worried about their final home, the tomb. They spent years, sometimes an entire lifetime, preparing just to ensure the journey to the afterlife would go smoothly. Because in their mind, death was not the end. It was a door. And beyond that door lay trials, judgment, and, if fortune allowed, eternity in a boundless field of reeds. So now let us step through that threshold. From the stifling heat of the Nile, from the constant threat of illness, we follow the Egyptians into life's greatest passage, the preparation for death, the rituals of farewell, and the fragile hope that one's soul might not weigh more than a single feather. You've lived a short life by the Nile, enduring heat, sand, sickness, and bread as hard as stone. But death, as inevitable as it was not the end. It was only the beginning of another journey. And the very first place you arrive after leaving your tired body behind is the hall of Ma'at, the grand chamber of truth, justice, and judgment. Picture this. You step into a vast hall, nothing like your crumbling mud brick home. Here, stone columns reach skyward, cool air hums in silence, and the scent of old incense and tree sap wraps around you like a memory. You are no longer hot, no longer dusty, no longer drenched in sweat. But in exchange, you now face something more terrifying, a scale. A great, sacred scale. On one side, your heart, not the pink Valentine's kind, but a dense, crimson-brown muscle, heavy with memories, fears, desires, and every lie you've ever told. On the other side, a single white feather, the feather of Ma'at, goddess of truth and balance. Your task is simple and impossible. Prove your heart is no heavier than that feather. If you fail, then your journey ends here. Gathered around you are 42 divine judges. Each god asks one question. Have you lied, stolen, cheated at the market stall? You must answer no to all of them, with the calmest, most innocent face you can muster. But it's not easy. You remember the extra handful of grain you once took, the curse you mumbled when sand blew into your eyes. At the center of the hall sits Osiris, god of the dead, skin green as sprouting wheat, tall white crown on his head, crook and flail in hand, watching silently, the eye of Horus. Beside you, jackal-headed Anubis prepares the scale. You have no lawyer. And the sentence, if it goes poorly, could last forever. In the moment your heart is weighed, your life flashes back in fragments. Each stolen bite of bread, each whispered complaint, each sip of beer taken when it wasn't your turn. They all flicker like shadows behind your eyes. And you wonder, is your heart heavier than a feather? If it is not, if your heart is light, you pass. You walk forward into the field of reeds, a place more beautiful, more abundant, more peaceful than any Nile sunrise you've ever seen. But if it is too heavy, your soul meets Amit, a beast part crocodile, part lion, part hippo, the Egyptian answer to nightmares. Amit doesn't judge, she doesn't wait, she devours, and with that you are gone. No rebirth, no paradise, just nothing. To modern ears this might sound cruel, but to the Egyptians this was justice. In a world where pharaohs dined on honey and wine, while farmers gnawed on sand-filled bread, the afterlife was the one place where balance truly existed. And this wasn't myth. This was real. They prepared for this judgment for years. The Book of the Dead, full of prayers and spells, served like an exam guide, a cheat sheet for the final test of the soul. You could study, rehearse your answers, even practice the lies that might just sound like truth to a divine ear. It's almost funny. We study with flashcards. They studied with papyrus scrolls and sacred chants, hoping their hearts would pass muster. But in a world where death might come from a single infected scratch, or a failed childbirth, or a fever, preparing for the afterlife wasn't a luxury. It was survival. So now, standing in the Hall of Maat, you don't feel pain, you don't feel heat, you feel silence. And a quiet, quivering question: will your heart be forgiven? Will it be enough? And if you're listening to these words in the gentle dark of your room, perhaps you too are weighing your life today. Not with a feather, but with a hush inside you, wondering, did I live lightly today? You've lived a short life by the Nile through heat, sand, sickness, and bread that could chip your teeth. But death, as inevitable as it was not the end. It was merely the beginning of something larger. And to reach the Hall of Maat, the Egyptians had to prepare. Preparing for death was never rushed. It was a lifelong project. And strangely enough, they often invested more in dying than in living. Picture this. Your house near the river is made of mud bricks, fragile, melting in just a few good rains. But your tomb is built from eternal stone. Life is an inn. The grave is home. A quiet paradox the Egyptians accepted with ease. From a young age, people began to save not for luxuries, but for their funeral. Linen cloths, ceramic jars, beads and amulets, tiny statues called shabti, all gathered patiently, waiting for the day you'd leave this world. If you were poor, perhaps just a few strips of cloth, a small jug, and a crust of dry bread. If you were wealthy, then a treasure trove descended with you into the earth. And then there was the ritual everyone knew: mummification. A process that lasted weeks, sometimes over 70 days. The dead were brought to a mummification workshop, a dark room, thick with the scent of resin, spices, and slow decay. The embalmer, robed in white linen, began his task. First came the brain, removed by sliding a hooked rod through the nose, stirring, then drawing it out in pieces. Not elegant, but the Egyptians believed the brain meant little. The heart mattered most, so the brain could go. Next came the organs: liver, lungs, stomach, intestines. All removed, washed, salted, and placed in canopic jars, each guarded by a god: a man, a monkey, a jackal, a falcon. The hollow body was packed with linens, straw, or tree resin to keep its shape. Then came natron, a natural salt used to draw out every last drop of moisture. Weeks passed, the body dried, then hundreds of layers of linen were wound, one by one. Painstaking, but the goal was simple: preserve the body. For the Egyptians believed the soul needed a physical home to return to. If the body decayed, the soul would lose its way. To us that might sound strange, but in a world where death lingered always near, mummification was their quiet resistance against rot, against time. The funeral itself was not just a private affair, it was communal. Relatives, friends, neighbors, they all came, mourning loudly, sometimes even hiring professional mourners to ensure the grief was grand enough. The procession moved through the village, carrying the mummy in a wooden coffin, followed by offerings. For the rich, musicians, dancers, and more little statues to be buried with the dead. At the tomb, the burial began. One ritual in particular mattered most: the opening of the mouth. The priest touched a tool to the lips of the mummy to restore the ability to eat, drink, breathe, and speak in the afterlife. A small gesture, but filled with meaning. No one wanted to enter eternity silent and hungry. And the irony? While the dead were wrapped, perfumed, and honored, the living still chewed gritty bread and drank flat beer. truly a world where one suffered in life to be treated like royalty in death. Of course, the poor couldn't afford the same rituals. Often they were buried directly in the sand, hoping the dry heat would do the preserving naturally, a kind of mummification by chance. But if you were a pharaoh or noble, your tomb was no shallow pit. It was monumental, a pyramid, a chamber hidden in the Valley of Kings, grand projects that took decades to complete, with thousands of laborers, millions of stone blocks, all for someone who would never rise from their resting place. But this extravagance reflected their belief. Death was the real life. And tombs weren't just stone and silence. They held everyday items too: jewelry, weapons, clothing, bread, beer, even children's toys. It was a long journey, and one must be well packed, a vacation with no return. When the coffin was lowered, when the tomb sealed, when dust and sand whispered down, it seemed like the end. But for the Egyptians, it was just the beginning. They believed the soul carried on, taking with it every item so carefully prepared. And in the quiet dark of the tomb, there was peace, a kind of peace the living rarely knew. If you look closely, you'll see that the entire Egyptian world was like a great machine, built for one purpose: to serve the dead. They planted, molded clay, wove fabric, carved stone, all in service of the next life. And within this steady rhythm, a strange truth reveals itself. Death was the engine of life. Egyptians didn't live to enjoy the now, they lived to ensure their death would carry them into something better. And perhaps, as you lie here listening in the dark, you find it odd and perfectly reasonable. Because preparing for a long journey has always made the going easier. The Egyptians somehow turned death into departure, not an end, but a continuation. And maybe, when you close your eyes, you too are rehearsing for a farther, quieter voyage ahead. If you think that after a long funeral, a careful embalming and being sealed away in a hidden tomb, you'd finally rest in peace, I'm sorry. You've overestimated ancient Egypt's ability to keep secrets, because from the moment the very first tombs were built, so too was born a parallel profession: tomb robbing. It sounds horrifying, but it became so common it was practically a natural consequence of burying treasure with the dead. Just imagine, while the living chewed sand-laced bread and drank warm beer, mere meters beneath the ground lay vaults of gold, jewels, fine linens, perfumed oils, feasts sealed in jars. Even the most honest soul would have struggled to resist. And for the starving, or the underpaid guards posted outside, the temptation was a whisper in the dark. Tomb robbing became so widespread that by the New Kingdom, there were actual court records documenting the trials of grave thieves. Some were villagers, some were tomb workers, and some were the very guards tasked with protecting the dead. They confessed in detail how they chiseled through walls, pried open coffins, split the loot. The scenes read like transcripts from a village heist trial. To stop this, the Egyptians came up with a unique solution: the curse. You've probably heard of the Pharaoh's curse, inscriptions etched into tomb walls, warning that intruders would suffer divine punishment: starvation, dehydration, snakebite, or crocodile attack. Some curses were rather creative. One reads, "Whoever enters, know this, your head will shatter like pottery, and you shall breathe sunlight no more." You might picture something eerie, supernatural, but in truth, a curse was just fear-based marketing. It didn't truly stop grave robbers, but it made the living feel as though at least some spiritual protection was in place. Ironically, most tombs weren't robbed centuries later. They were robbed almost immediately. Guards, workers, even officials colluded. They knew exactly where the tombs were, how they were built, how to unlock the doors. In some cases, they broke down walls, took every last treasure but left the mummy untouched. A strange kind of reverence. Plunder the wealth but leave the body in peace. As for those famous stories, like archaeologists dying mysteriously after opening Tutankhamun's tomb, most are 20th century myths, deaths from malaria, infections, accidents, repackaged as curses for dramatic flair. The ancient Egyptians might chuckle, we wrote those curses for local looters, not for Westerners in pith helmets. Still, there's no denying, entering an Egyptian tomb can feel unsettling. The air is stale and still. The dark is total. The smell is sharp and ancient. The walls blaze with color, yet depict unnerving scenes. Anubis with the head of a jackal, Osiris with green skin, monsters guarding the threshold. In that silence, you can't help but feel watched. But beyond the spiritual unease, grave robbing had real consequences. Most royal tombs were stripped bare. By the time modern archaeologists arrived at the Valley of the Kings, they found only empty chambers, scattered bones, and broken pottery shards. Only in rare cases like that of Tutankhamun did a nearly untouched treasure remain, and only because his tomb had been forgotten, buried beneath other works. The cruel irony, a whole civilization designed an elaborate system to honor the dead, only for it to be undone by a few men with chisels and oil lamps. For a pharaoh, this was disaster. If the burial goods were stolen, the soul would have nothing in the afterlife. So the curses were more than warnings. They were desperate pleas. Let us rest. And now, as you lie there in the dark, perhaps a bitter smile forms, because across all time, humans remain the same. Temptation is hard to resist. In ancient Egypt, it lay just beneath the golden sand. People lived in poverty, prepared for death with luxury. And then the survivors quietly took it all back. A circle of greed and fear, of hope for rest and the harshness of reality. So the next time you see an Egyptian statue, its eyes wide, gazing straight ahead, you might imagine it still standing guard, still hoping that maybe this time no one will knock. In a world where heat, sand, and sickness always lurked just around the corner, the ancient Egyptians believed they possessed a weapon more powerful than any sword, more enduring than any block of stone: writing. But not writing like you're looking at on your screen now. Not neat letters and spaces, but a system so intricate, so symbol-filled, that just looking at it might make your eyelids start to droop. They called it Medu Netja, the words of the gods. And to them, writing wasn't just about communication, it was divine. Each hieroglyph, whether it was a bird, an eye, a waving river, or an outstretched hand, didn't just mean something, it was something, alive, powerful. To write someone's name was to anchor their soul to this world. To erase it was to kill them. Again, imagine you're a farmer by the Nile. Your days are full of mud and sand and coarse bread. Everything you do is swept away by time and wind. But if a scribe wrote your name on the tomb wall, suddenly you existed forever. That's the power of a few scratches in stone. So it's no surprise the scribe held a sacred place in society. They didn't haul bricks or grind grain. They sat in the shade, reed brush in hand, dipping ink made of soot and red earth, writing slowly, deliberately. To most people, their job seemed both magical and enviable. While thousands sweated under the sun to build pyramids, a small group wrote things down and were called servants of the divine. Not a bad deal. You see this power best in religious texts. On tomb walls, sarcophagi, scrolls of papyrus lines and lines of carefully etched symbols guide the dead on their journey through the afterlife. The Book of the Dead wasn't really a book. It was a spiritual roadmap. Every spell, every prayer, written with the hope that the deceased could read, or at least remember what to say when they met the gods. Without those words, A soul was just another wanderer in the desert of death. No compass, no guideposts. And here's the funny part. Hieroglyphs were both beautiful and brutal. Hundreds of symbols, many with multiple meanings. Learning to write took years, so writing never became a tool for the masses. It was elite, almost like a secret code. Think learning French or Japanese is hard. Try memorizing 1,000 signs where messing up one owl or eye symbol might doom someone's soul. No pressure. Take Pharaohs, for instance. When a king rose to power, his name was encased in a cartouche, an elongated oval like a protective bubble. It acted like a shield, preserving his name, and therefore his essence, for eternity. If a king fell from favor, successors would chisel out his name, erase him from statues and walls. Not just a political move, but a kind of spiritual assassination. And of course, writing wasn't just for the dead. It shaped the living world too. Legal documents, tax records, crop tallies, all in hieroglyphs. A peasant who couldn't read was vulnerable. Picture this, a smiling official writes a string of birds and eyes and says, "This says you owe just 1 sack of grain." But really, it says 3. How would you know? The words might as well be a maze. But beyond bureaucracy, writing was magic. A prayer inscribed on a wall became a shield. A snake drawn with text became bound. Writing froze speech, made it eternal. It wasn't just language, it was spellcraft. And in funerals, hieroglyphs were the key. Walk into a tomb, you'll find every inch of wall covered in writing. Not just stories about the dead, like he was a kind father and loyal husband, but instructions, literal directions. Turn left at the lake of fire. Recite this spell if a serpent blocks your way. It sounds like an ancient video game. But to the Egyptians, this was serious spiritual navigation. There's a quiet irony here. The living worked and sweated to build tombs, but the dead lived on through words. So long as your name was spoken or read, you still existed. Immortality didn't live in your mummified body, it lived in the scratchings on stone. If you're listening to this in the dark, maybe you're smiling now, because we're not so different. Your name on a social media profile, the letters on your ID, those are today's cartouches. Erase them and you disappear from the system. Maybe we're all still living through language, still trusting in the power of symbols. Only difference? No more birds and crocodiles, just Arial and Times New Roman. So next time you see a wall of hieroglyphs, don't just think ancient art. Think a contract with eternity. A quiet plea from someone thousands of years ago. Let me be remembered. If the ancient Egyptians had a dream home for the afterlife, it wasn't a golden palace in the clouds. It was simple, familiar. A place called the Field of Reeds, an endless landscape of calm waters, soft sunshine, fertile fields and gentle breezes. No scorching heat, no mosquitoes, no crocodiles in the water or sand in your beer. After a lifetime of toiling in the mud by the Nile, this version of paradise wasn't about excess, it was about relief. In the Egyptian imagination, the Field of Reeds was a cleaner, softer copy of the world they already knew. You'd still harvest barley, rowboats, and tend your land. But here's the difference. You'd never get tired, never grow hungry. And the tax collector, he never shows up. Of course, getting in wasn't easy. To earn your eternal plot of land, you had to pass every test. Weigh your heart against a feather. Answer questions from 42 divine judges. Recite the right spells from a scroll of papyrus. Only then would Osiris greet you, hand you your key to eternity, and you'd settle into your perfect afterlife, not for a week's holiday, but forever. In a way, the Egyptians invented the world's first retirement plan. It was just a little more expensive and a lot harder to qualify for. The ironic part? The paradise they imagined was simple, but the ticket to get in required a vast and complicated system, mummification.
Tomb building, wall carvings, offerings, buried treasures. Heaven was humble, but access to it? A luxury industry. In fact, no other civilization in history built an entire economy around the afterlife quite like Egypt. Coffin makers, mural painters, shabti figurine sculptors, scribes copying the Book of the Dead. They all made a living off other people's dying. A funeral industry that lasted millennia. Compare that with other ancient cultures, and the Egyptian difference becomes clear. The Greeks had an afterlife too, but it was gloomy.
Whether hero or farmer, everyone ended up in a grey underworld by the river Styx. Nobody dreamed of going there. The Chinese imagined a bureaucratic spirit world filled with paperwork, judges, and punishments, a worse version of real life. The Maya and Aztecs pictured Xibalba, a terrifying realm of traps and gods that tormented souls. Only Egypt turned the afterlife into a reward. Not a punishment, not a test, a perfected Egypt where every inconvenience of the real world was gently erased and simple joys lasted forever. That's why they valued death more than life. You might only live to 30 or 40, but if you prepared well, you earned eternity. All those tombs, statues, texts, not just royal ego, they were part of a national project, a cultural investment in another parallel world. The Egyptians, it seems, were the only civilization to put the afterlife at the center of their art, economy, religion, and politics. From today's perspective, it's almost funny. We save up to buy houses, pay off debt, and retire. So did the Egyptians, except their house was made of limestone, their savings were amulets and statues, and their retirement had no end date. So the next time you walk into an ancient tomb, see the carved walls, the vivid paintings, the carefully buried possessions, remember, this wasn't a display for the living. It was a boarding pass, a survival kit, a one-way ticket to the field of reeds, where the most modest dream, a life without pain, became a national obsession. If you had to sum it all up, you might say, Greece gave us tragedy, China gave us dynasties, the Maya gave us death games, but Egypt gave us a forever economy, a civilization that built pyramids, temples, and an entire society on the hope that, at the end of it all, you'd find your way to the quiet, swaying stillness of the field of reeds. You can see it now for the ancient Egyptians. Death was never the end, it was a doorway, a passage into a better life with fertile fields, cool beer, and bread without a single grain of sand. But that golden ticket, it didn't come free. You had to prepare your entire life, and often only those with wealth or power could afford the packing list for eternity. Meanwhile, the majority of people kept farming, breathing in dust, living short lives, and dying quietly. No pyramids. No personalized Book of the Dead, sometimes not even a coffin. If the afterlife was a grand banquet, they stood outside, watching through the cracks in the door. Inside, the pharaohs and elites, living in luxury and preparing for death with tombs so massive, the entire world is still stunned by them today. And it's this contrast between the eternal comfort of the few and the hard, forgotten toil of the many that shapes the real face of ancient Egypt. So for now, let's step away from the peaceful field of reeds. Let's walk toward the blinding light of gold, of perfume, of feasts,
And of monuments so huge you'd never want to build them with your bare hands. If you've survived the heat, the dust, the flies, the plagues, and the post-death judgment we just explored, congratulations. You're still not free, because there's one more thing waiting for you. The blinding glare of ancient Egyptian showmanship. The Egyptians, especially the upper class, were masters of turning their bodies into living billboards for wealth and divine favor. Let's start with clothing. If you were a commoner, your fashion was a single sheet of linen so thin it stuck to your skin with the breeze. Cool and practical, yes, but not exactly a showstopper for ancient Instagram. No filter could save that outfit. But if you were nobility, that same linen became art. Finer weave, whiter, layered to the point of being heavy and stifling. Archaeologists have found pleated gowns, elaborately folded skirts, and huge beaded collars draped across the shoulders. Jewels so heavy.
It was like wearing an entire market stall around your neck. Comfort? Who needs comfort when you're trying to look richer than your neighbor? And of course, makeup. The Egyptians didn't just wear it, they owned it. Their eyeliner, made from crushed galena or malachite, thick, bold, dramatic. But it wasn't just for looks, it was sunblock, insect repellent, and a charm to ward off evil eyes. Yes, their eyeliner was SPF off, bug spray, and spiritual armor in one sleek black stroke. They also had green eyeshadow, red ochre blush, perfumes made of lotus and resin. Men and women both wore makeup. And showing up without it? Basically, the ancient version of attending a formal meeting without pants. In that relentless sun and swirling dust, a bit of lotus oil and color probably felt like a declaration. I am alive, I am human, I still care. Then there were the amulets. If you wear a jade bracelet or lettered necklace today, congrats, you've got something in common with ancient Egypt. They had scarabs for luck, the eye of Horus for protection, and the Ankh for life eternal. Inside tombs, hundreds of these charms were lovingly placed between mummy wrappings, one to keep the heart from wandering, one to let the mouth speak spells, one, perhaps, just to look good in the afterlife. Yes, accessories never go out of style, even underground. The divide was clear. A poor laborer might have one clay amulet. A rich official would glitter in gold, emeralds, perfumes, and carved jade. You could tell a person's social class by their makeup and their magic. Fashion was ID, your linen was your passport, your eyeliner was your resume. But here's the irony. No amount of eyeliner, no mountain of amulets, no perfect linen folds could save you from the dust, the disease, or the sudden end that waited for everyone. Whether you were a bare-chested farmer or a pharaoh dipped in gold, you ended up in a tomb. The only question was, limestone monument or shallow grave? So if you ever find yourself imagining a street in ancient Egypt, eye paint gleaming, perfume drifting on the wind, shimmering amulets dancing in the sun, you can admire it, you can smile, and you can remember, beneath all that shimmer, they were just people, sweaty, dusty, and quietly dreaming of a place where they wouldn't have to fight with their own eyeliner just to survive the day. If your days are filled with hauling water, pounding grain, chewing on stone-hard bread, and sipping warm beer, then anything that isn't work counts as fun. In ancient Egypt, joy didn't explode, it drifted, slow and steady like the Nile. Sometimes it swelled during festivals and then receded, leaving behind a bit of silt. And a few mild hangovers, no Spotify, no concert tickets, no weekend BBQs, but you had drums, you had the sistrame, clattering metal rattle, you had harps, flutes, and lutes, you had the scent of lotus oil mixed with the scent of people, riverfish, beer, and smoke. And you had something rare, a moment to breathe half a beat slower. It was called a festival, and it filled the space in a world without annual leave. Festivals followed nature's rhythm. The river rises, time to thank Happy. The sun defeats darkness, a toast to Ra. A new season begins. Cue Wepet Renpet with music, drink, and the humble wish that this year, maybe less, sand ends up in your bread. The heart of any festival, a god on tour. Since gods weren't visible, they were carried, wrapped in mystery, hidden in a shrine, lifted onto the shoulders of strong men, and paraded slowly, swaying in rhythm with drums, rattles, and chants that were part reverence, part exhaustion. Villagers lined the path, wearing linen just a shade brighter than usual, clapping to a beat simple enough for tired hands to keep. Some festivals encouraged, well, drinking. Take the feasts of Hathor or Sekhmet, where beer was basically sacred. Drink to forget chaos. Drink to please the gods. Drink so the sun would rise tomorrow. We might call it blowing off steam. They called it religion. You'd hold a jug of beer thick as porridge, tilt your head back, feel the warm buzz loosen your limbs. Drums pounded, limbs swayed with simple steps. Sweat mingled with perfume, a brief, collective sway of bodies that felt almost free. No climaxes, no fireworks, just rhythm. The next morning, you were back to bread beer field. But that night, you breathed 2 beats slower. Music here wasn't grand. Hand drums gave you heartbeat. The sistrum chattered like metallic wind. Flutes sang simple, blunt melodies. Harps stretched slow rivers of sound. Lutes plucked single notes, quietly optimistic. Everyone joined in, no rehearsals, no band rolls. If your hands were free, you drummed. If your heart felt light, you danced. If you were tired, you just sat and let your bangles sway gently. No one asked if your timing was right. They asked, did the gods smile today? Will the barley grow tomorrow? Everyday joys were even more modest. You had Senet, a board game of squares and guessing. The rules, half remembered, half invented. You tossed handmade dice, moved wooden tokens, and hoped fortune didn't play favorites. Mehen was a coiled snake board. You traced its spiral like your own life. Floods, taxes, orders, round and round. Not thrilling, but steady, perfect for aching knees. Kids? They tossed stones, sprinted barefoot, played in river mud, sailed little papyrus boats downstream. They laughed for no reason. Each day, just training to handle the heat better. Richer families had fancier fun. Banquets, low tables, reclining seats, servants pouring wine, offering roasted goose, fat ducks, grilled fish, figs, dates, and raisins. Guests wore thick makeup and cone-shaped wax perfumes on their heads. The cones melted slowly, oiling their hair, scenting the sweat with lotus and human. Musicians played one-line songs, repeating verses like mantras, not to stir the crowd, but to soothe it. Dancers moved gracefully, curved arms, pointed toes, circular wrists. Expressions stayed still because smiling too hard was tiring. Laughter floated through the air, thin as an onion skin, but still laughter, rare as clean water. And hunting or fishing, survival for the poor, recreation for the rich. Boats drifted into reeds, nets cast, spears thrown, fish shimmered in the sunlight, birds scattered, feathers floated, water lapped, reeds whispered. People spoke softly, hoping Sobek wouldn't send crocodiles. For elites, private garden ponds replaced the Nile. Cleaner, quieter, no crocs allowed. You might also have pets. Cats goddesses disguised as rodent control glanced at you like, I protect your grain. You owe me a shrine. Dogs, loyal companions, monkeys, high-maintenance entertainers, ibises and sacred birds strutted in noble gardens. Status symbols in feathers, part friend, part property. Sometimes part offering. Grand festivals like Opet in Thebes linked temples through processions. From Luxor to Karnak, Amun went for a walk. Officials bowed, villagers watched. Even if you were far, you could feel it, not with your eyes, but through sound. Drums shifted their rhythm, steadier, like a gentle storm. A few days later, it ended. The world returned, planting, weeding, harvesting, drying. Instruments were hung high, out of children's reach. Until next time, Music served gods, but it also soothed pain. Healers chanted, gently rattled the sistrum, dabbed honey, pressed warm cloth. The sick gazed up at ceilings made of palm fronds, listening to the soft metallic jingle, and for a moment the pain stepped aside. It didn't cure, but it comforted. In a world where herbs and spells were woven from the same cloth, sound was the cheapest painkiller. For the poor, festivals meant eating better. Bread was whiter, the flour was finer, beer was less sour, the yeast behaved. Maybe an onion, maybe dates, maybe even a sliver of fish. Elders sat in the shade, watching children run, listening to drums, sipping slowly, and recalling the year with the most beautiful flood. Pleasure was mild, not strong, just enough for deep sleep. The market buzzed a bit louder, extra linens with little patterns, cheap glass beads, perfume knockoffs pretending to be temple-made. Vendors shouted, their voices dry as sand. You bought a small clay amulet, a blue eye of Horus, tied it around your son's neck. You told him it would keep him safe. He didn't understand. But it sparkled, and he smiled. And that, like music, was rhythm enough. No need to be loud, just present. The smaller village rituals came more often than the grand festivals in the capital. Thanksgiving after harvest, a prayer for unseasonal rain, offerings for a sick loved one. And each time the same scene unfolded, slow drums, rattles, a looping chant, a little wine, a shared plate of food, and sometimes a goat used down to the last bone. No need for novelty. Repetition was safety. The rhythm of repetition let people feel like someone was holding their hand through the passing of time. At the royal level, everything was magnified. Larger orchestras, shinier instruments, linen so white it hurt the eyes, taller headdresses, gold that made the sun reflect twice. But the purpose stayed the same, to lull people into believing in order. Rituals weren't there to surprise the gods. They were there to comfort the living, to say, the sun still rises. The river still swells. The pharaoh is still the pharaoh. And the farmer is still the farmer. Amid all of that, you sometimes caught your own quiet moments. At dusk, by the river, wiping dust from your face, listening to an elder pluck a worn-out harp. The strings were loose, the notes blurred, the melody wandered in circles of three. You exhaled, thoughtless. It was the simplest pleasure. No ceremony, no prayers, no beer. Just the river wind, and a melody trying to remember its name. There were no weekends, rituals filled that gap. They didn't change your fate. They just shifted where you hurt. Your arms might ache less from not carrying water, but your throat would be sore from singing. A fair trade. The next morning, you'd return to your work, but the smell of perfumed oil still clung to your shirt. A fallen bead glinted underfoot. A rhythm still hummed faintly in your head, enough to carry you through the hottest stretch of noon. And if there's one irony greater than all, it's this. In a civilization known for its colossal monuments, the joys were small. No colosseums, no grand stages, just the yard, the riverbank, the shade of a palm tree, a chant made of 3 or 4 words, a rattle echoing softly on the wrist of a woman who just finished baking bread. Pleasure here was like how Egyptians saw life, not explosive, not daring, but steady, repetitive, enough to go on. If you asked, were they happy? The answer would hum like a background drumbeat. They had quiet moments, thin laughter, a few safe nights under divine eyes. No one escaped the heat, the sand, or the tough bread. But in between, music and ritual, however brief, laid a soft cloth over the world, just enough to make it less harsh, enough for a deeper sleep, enough to wake and slip your feet back into reed sandals and keep walking. And if you belong to the few, the ones with gold, with fine perfume, with musicians of your own, your pleasures came thicker, longer, layered. Banquets that stretched past midnight, dancers who spun until their arms ached, lotus flowers replaced again and again. But strangely, when the music stopped, silence felt the same in a rich home or a poor one. Both heard the insects in the night. Both felt the desert breeze slip through the cracks. Both knew the sun would rise again, right on time. And in that moment, the differences blurred, leaving only one shared rhythm. A heartbeat, steady, like a framed drum somewhere far off. And just like that, another festival ended. No fireworks, just the warm after scent of burned incense. You snuffed the oil lamp, drew the linen cloth over your belly, closed your eyes. In your mind, a tiny rattle still jingled from far away. You smiled without knowing why. Maybe because tomorrow will still be hard, but tonight was still. Still. In ancient Egypt, joy wasn't for changing your life. It was for oiling the scrapes. So in the morning, you'd still remember the way back to the fields. And so festivals, music, and joy were only soft blinks stitched into a long year of sun and wind. Not grand, not tragic, just enough. In a land where endurance was the highest virtue, just enough was a rare kind of luxury. You sleep. The drum slows, the rattle stills. The beer goes flat. The perfume fades, and on the clay wall the shadow of a reed trembles once, then freezes. Tomorrow, you'll wake before the music. But tonight, music woke before your dreams and cleared a path for them. If you thought the life of an Egyptian farmer was already hard enough, congratulations. This part will show you that their suffering didn't stop at the edge of a sunburnt field. It was stacked, stone by stone, into pyramids. Those monumental shapes that the modern world gazes at in awe, while the common folk of ancient Egypt once gazed at them and simply sighed. Yes, pyramids and temples weren't just symbols of Pharaoh's power. They were monuments to how human bodies could be ground down to preserve that power. Picture this. Egypt's sun blazes like a kiln set outside at noon. Below, thousands of laborers, many of them seasonal farmers, drag limestone blocks, each weighing tons, across wooden sledges. To make it easier, they sometimes poured water on the sand to reduce friction. But easier meant you might die from exhaustion in 5 days instead of 3. No one asked if they wanted this job. Because pyramids weren't built for the people, they were built for one man. A king they weren't even allowed to look at directly, to have a forever home after death. Egypt didn't invent weekends. It had farming seasons. When the Nile flooded and fields were too wet to sow, farmers were invited to help build monuments for the king. Some modern archaeologists, gentle in hindsight, like to say this was corvée labor, not slavery. But if you were a tired farmer hoping to rest in the shade for a few weeks and instead found yourself dragging multi-ton stones under the sun, did it really matter whether they called it duty or chains? You might have wondered, why doesn't the king build it himself? The answer, of course, because he was busy sitting in his palace wearing a crown, drinking imported wine, and telling scribes to carve his name in stone as large as possible. The pyramid wasn't just a tomb, it was a stone billboard. Every block, every edge, every carved line shouted, "Look how powerful our Pharaoh is, even nature bows before him." Today we stare at the pyramids and whisper, how did they build this? But poor Egyptians of the time never asked. They knew exactly how, with backs, with bones, with bloodied hands and spines bent for life. Temples were no different. Karnak, Luxor, Abu Simbel. Built like eternal stages for gods and kings, temples weren't just sacred, they were spectacles. You walked into one, and the columns soared taller than palm trees. Sunlight slipped between roof gaps and fell cold on stone gods that stared back, unblinking. The walls, thick with hieroglyphs, told only one story. The Pharaoh won. The Pharaoh gave offerings. The Pharaoh was close to the gods. No wall ever said, the villagers sat in the sun for 3 days straight, ate bread as dry as dust, and drank muddy water to build this very place. And the bigger the monument, the more useless it often became. The grandest pyramid at Giza, looted within a few centuries. The mightiest temples, hotbeds of power, squabbles between priests and nobles. And the common folk? They weren't allowed inside the sanctum. They stood in the courtyards, peering past columns, listening to sacred chants drifting through the air, inhaling incense, knowing full well that the gap between them and the divine was as vast as the space between the muddy earth and the pyramid's pointed tip. Strangely, whether for gods or for kings, all these buildings shared one purpose: to convince people that the system was eternal. Stand beneath a pyramid and you feel so small you wouldn't dare think of rebellion. Who would dare rise up when even the stones bend to the king's will? In a land where every colossal structure screams that you are just dust, of course you'll behave like dust. But here's what made Egypt's monuments different from other ancient wonders. Romans built arenas to live, to cheer, to see blood spill. The Chinese built a wall to fight, to keep enemies out. The Maya built temples to sacrifice, to offer human blood to their gods. Egypt? Egypt built an entire economy just to construct a tomb for one dead man. That's right. They poured their strength, sweat, and years not into the living, but into the departed. A paradox uniquely Egyptian. You die young from labor, but your king gets an eternal house paved into the afterlife. Still, the side effects of these projects were real. They created jobs, coerced as they were, pushed technical innovation, and left behind structures that thousands of years later, tourists still line up to photograph. If one of those ancient farmers were to rise today, he'd probably be shocked to see the world queuing up to admire the place where he once sweated and cursed. He might say, "You people are strange. I gave my life to build this, and now you call it a wonder." And maybe, just maybe, he'd ask, "Do my descendants get a discount ticket?" In the end, the pyramids and temples were symbols of both greatness and suffering. To the pharaoh, they were proof of immortality. To the gods, they were luxury homes. To the elite, they were showcases. To the commoners, they were reminders that their lives would vanish like dust, while stone stood silent, cold, and tireless. And if you think these structures exist to honor the whole civilization, I'm sorry, no, they exist to honor one man, the one with absolute power. Yet for all the irony, we must admit, because of that selfish ambition, we now have what we call a world wonder. The cost was immense, but history has never cared about who paid the bill. You look up at the pyramid, its sharp tip piercing the dry blue sky. You know a part of tens of thousands of lives was ground to dust to lift that tip so high. And you exhale. This is Egypt, a civilization that turned sweat into stone and power into shape. Something that still stands long after those who built it have become sand. One of the greatest paradoxes of ancient Egypt was how life and death constantly wove into each other. Ordinary people died young, quickly and quietly, but the elite pharaohs, officials, priests spent their entire lives preparing for death. If you were an average Egyptian farmer, your life expectancy was about 30 or 40. Live longer and you became a local legend. That old man must have a god watching over him. But for a pharaoh, death was no surprise. It was a long-term project, a national enterprise, sometimes planned from the very day they put on the crown. Now imagine you are a farmer. You wake up in the stifling heat, eat dry bread, drink beer as thick as watered-down porridge. You work the fields, carry water, labor, until the sun bleeds into the horizon. Then you die, maybe from malaria, maybe from an infected cut, maybe from the sand slowly tearing up your lungs. There's no procession, no drums, no grand farewell. Your family buries you in a shallow pit, maybe wraps you in rough cloth, maybe not. No oils, no salt, just dirt. Within a few flood seasons, you vanish entirely. Meanwhile, if you're a pharaoh, the opposite. The moment you take the throne, the clock starts ticking on your tomb. A pyramid, a valley crypt, a cliffside monument. The entire economy bends to the task. Tens of thousands of laborers, scribes, sculptors, priests, all mobilized to ensure that when you stop breathing, you won't stop existing. You are embalmed in a 70-day ritual, oiled, wrapped in fine linen, laid in carved wood, and again in heavy stone. Across your chest lie amulets of gold, turquoise and carnelian, everything to ensure your heart balances with the feather of Ma'at. And the common folk? If they're lucky, a little clay charm in the hand of the dead, hoping Osiris is feeling merciful. But most had nothing, just bones and sand. The difference wasn't just in the rituals, it was in mindset. For the average person, life was a short struggle against hunger, illness, and heat. No time for eternal dreams. But for the elite, eternity was the only thing worth living for. Life was a prelude. The real event came after. A farmer saw death as sadness, as silence. A pharaoh saw it as a second coronation, not for the world of men, but for the world of gods. Pharaohs were buried with gold, weapons, perfumes, even wooden boats for the next world. The poor were buried with nothing but their worn-out skeletons. Here's the irony. It was the sweat, blood, and short lives of the many that built the everlasting graves of the few. A peasant died, young, hauling limestone, so the king could live forever in polished granite. One death in haste, one death in grandeur, coexisting. Today we look at murals in the Valley of the Kings, the Pharaoh, dining, hunting, dancing with gods. But outside these tombs, thousands of lives came and went, unnoticed. No murals, no hymns, just wind, sand, and forgetting. This is the uncomfortable truth of Egyptian history. The short lives of the many were the foundation for the endless afterlife of the few. Ordinary and glorious deaths weren't opposites. They were two ends of the same machine. Without the toiling death of the masses, there would be no eternal resting place for royalty. If you had lived in ancient Egypt, odds are you would die young, unmourned. But perhaps the stone you lifted for a pyramid, the line you carved in a tomb, still stands today. The glory belongs to the pharaoh, but the calluses, they were yours. And as you wiped sweat from your face under that punishing sun, maybe you thought, eternity isn't for people like me. It's for those I can't even look in the eye. That paradox of ordinary death and elite eternity is part of what makes Egypt so magnificent, so unjust, and so impossibly compelling. If you were to search for a reason why ancient Egypt lasted as long as it did, through dozens of dynasties across more than 3,000 years of history, the answer wouldn't lie solely in the Nile River or in the wheat fields, or even in the looming pyramids. The answer, perhaps, rests in how the Egyptians understood life and death, and how they turned the luxury of a few into a collective legacy. Imagine this. Every civilization has its own way of asserting power. Chinese emperors built the Forbidden City not just a residence, but the administrative heart of an empire. Roman emperors raised the Colosseum, both as entertainment and proof of imperial might. The Maya kings of Tikal erected stepped pyramids like vertebrae rising from the jungle. But only the Egyptians poured the greatest share of their effort not into life but into death. Tombs, monuments, and temples were built as if the afterlife were the only real destination worth investing in. This might sound ironic, but it worked. The Forbidden City was looted by war, the Colosseum crumbled, yet the pyramids of Giza still stand, watching history unroll beneath them. The place where a pharaoh was meant to rest became the longest-lasting witness to an entire civilization's existence. The Egyptians may be gone, their kings mummified, but the tombs remain, reminding us that they once believed in eternity, and in some way they reached it. Egypt's legacy also endures because of its obsession with order. Everything revolved around Ma'at, the cosmic principle of balance and harmony. People endured hardship believing that if everyone performed their role correctly, that divine order would hold and they might earn a place in the eternal field of reeds. This belief bound society together for millennia, even as most citizens died young, besieged by disease and dust. But let's not forget this legacy was also built on inequality. Those glorious structures rose from the sweat, blood, and short lives of millions whose names we'll never know. It was this chasm between the few and the many that carved Egypt into eternity. The suffering of the masses engraved the name of Egypt into stone. Compared to other civilizations, the difference becomes stark. In China, emperors left behind palaces to be walked through, a reminder of their power in life. In Rome, emperors left behind roads, aqueducts, and theater structures for the living. In Maya lands, temples were tied to the stars, but eventually surrendered to the jungle. In Egypt, the pharaoh left behind a tomb for himself, and that's what survives. Their legacy, strangely enough, is death itself, wrapped in stone, gold, and spells. Today, we stare at the Sphinx, we squint at hieroglyphs chiseled into temple walls and ask, how did they last so long? The answer might be this strange fusion of religious fervor, collective muscle, and an unshakable belief that death was not the end, but the beginning of a serious logistical project. They didn't just prepare for the afterlife, they industrialized it, a full economic system built around the business of burial. And maybe that's why we still remember them, not because of the lives of the ordinary brief and brutal, but because of the immortal tombs of the few. Egypt's endurance was the result of a civilization that bet everything on a dream, that eternity could be built with stone and sand. And in doing so, they achieved a kind of eternity not for individuals, but for the civilization itself. Now tourists jostle for selfies under the sun, pose in front of pyramids, then return to their air-conditioned hotels. They'll never know the dry heat, the sandy bread, or the 30-year life expectancy of Egypt's farmers. But thanks to those unjust monuments, Egypt survives in our collective memory. Had you lived then, you might not have lasted a day. But because they did, the human dream of eternity still lingers, standing tall in the desert for us to marvel at, sigh over, and perhaps chuckle bitterly at, amid the quiet ironies of history. And so we've reached the end of our long drift through ancient Egypt. We've woken under the burning sun, stumbled to the Nile, chewed sand-flavored bread, endured short lives and long funerals, and watched pharaohs rise into eternity while ordinary people faded quietly into the dust. It turns out that behind the golden mask and towering pyramids, life was mostly hot, itchy, and unfair. Yet that very struggle carved a civilization that still stands after thousands of years. A reminder, perhaps, that even misery can leave behind monuments. Thank you for joining me tonight on Historian Sleepy 365. If this boring history for sleep helped you rest, you can always come back for more journeys with your sleepy historian. Quiet stories that won't thrill you, but will keep you company as you drift away. So close your eyes, let the sand settle, and sleep well.